If you train on the mat long enough, you're gonna deal with some injuries. But what if you could train smarter, build a more resilient body, and avoid the stuff that sidelines most grapplers? In this episode, I'm breaking down what the data says about injuries in Jiu Jitsu and providing you with some practical tips that can help you stay on the mat for longer instead of off the mat sidelined with an injury. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Settlage Strength Podcast. I'm fired up and excited to be kicking it with you today. We're going to be talking about injuries in Jiu Jitsu. Jiu Jitsu is a combat sport, which means that injuries are going to happen. I think it is ignorant and foolish to do Jiu Jitsu and expect that you will never get injured. I say that because that was me. I thought like, oh, no, I know enough about strength and conditioning to not get injured, and like a freaking idiot. That obviously didn't happen. I've had a lot of injuries due to Jiu Jitsu. And unfortunately, injuries are going to happen, but that doesn't mean that there isn't anything that you can do to drastically decrease your risk of injury. Even though I have had two major injuries over the course of my jiu-jitsu career, and I've talked about them a lot on this podcast, I've been doing jiu-jitsu for the last 8.5 years, and I wrestled for 4 years before that. And of all of that time training on the mat, I've really only had 3 main serious injuries that took me off the mat, needed like a very structured physical therapy approach. Everything else was just like bumps and bruises here and there. But you take that 12.5 years of grappling training to only have 3 major injuries, in my mind, is a huge blessing. And by the grace of God, I haven't had a major injury in a very long time. And I think a lot of that is due to different practices, different things I'm doing on and off the mat to help drastically decrease my overall risk of injury. And the inspiration for this episode came from a new study that came out earlier this year in February. And it's a study by Pablo Martin Stegerhoik, Boris Brajovic, Paul Kujer, and Merwais Merab. And they published a study in BMJ Open Sport and Exercise Medicine called Injury Prevalence Among Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Practitioners Globally, a cross-sectional study in 881 participants. And I first heard about this study from the YouTube channel Less Impressed, More Involved, which I think is, I've been watching jiu-jitsu related content for a long time, and I think the Less Impressed, More Involved YouTube channel does the best job at breaking down jiu-jitsu concepts and does the best job on really creating great videos to help you enhance your overall skill development of submission grappling. And on that YouTube channel, Jake, the creator of that channel, he reviewed this study, and it was awesome. It was a very well done, in-depth video, and there's a lot of interesting takeaways and data points that came from the study about injuries that happen in jiu-jitsu. And based on some of this data, I think we can highlight some different things, and based off of those things, I think this is going to be great to help us better inform how we train on the mat as well as how we train in the gym. So when it comes to the study, the different things that they did were they looked at jiu-jitsu athletes across the globe. They surveyed 881 athletes. They looked at over 1,900 injuries over a 1-year span, and they had a massive sample size. They had high quality data, and this study was done very, very well. And so some of their key data points were, based on their findings, they found that the injury rate in training was about 5.5 injuries per 1,000 hours of training time. What was really interesting and probably the most surprising to me, or maybe not most surprising, but I didn't expect it to be this big of a jump when they compare injury rate in training versus injury rate in competition. The injury rate in competition is 55.9 injuries per 1,000 matches. That is pretty crazy in my mind. That's not to say that like every single person that ever enters a match in jiu-jitsu is going to get injured, but it just goes to show that, okay, as you compete, the risk of injury does go up quite a bit. And there's a lot of factors going into that, right? Like the emotions are higher, your adrenaline is pumping a lot more. You might be more willing to take a couple pops or even a break to win first place, or if you're competing for a cash prize. So that was very interesting. Another data point that was fascinating was 89% of all injuries happen in training, and of all the injuries that happen, 79% of them, 79% of the training injuries come from free sparring. And that makes sense, right? Like, free sparring is the most chaotic, it's the most live, it has the least amount of control, so to speak. That's not to say that like free sparring is just a free for all that's super dangerous. But if you were to drill a certain technique and say like, hey, I'm just going to passively grab your leg and pass it to this side of my body, it's pretty rare for an injury to happen in that context versus I'm actively trying to move your leg across my body and get a heel hook grip, versus you actively trying to not let that happen and pull your leg away and hide your heel and all that stuff. Based on their data, when it comes to most common injury sites, 25% of the injuries that they found were to the knees, 13% of the injuries were to the shoulders, and then they also had some data on other injury sites like ribs, chest, the neck, lower back, groin, foot, ankle, all of that stuff. What's most interesting about those data points is that is actually a little bit different to some other studies that have been done on grappling related injuries. And when I was in college, which was 6 years ago when I graduated college, my senior research project, or my senior seminar project, was about strength and conditioning for Jiu Jitsu athletes, or just grappling athletes in general, because I was also talked about wrestling and stuff like that. And at the time that I was doing that research project, there was some studies that came out about injuries in combat or in grappling-centered combat sports. So Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, submission grappling, Sambo, Olympic Judo, Olympic wrestling, and I think that they talked about collegiate wrestling in there as well. And that study was from Stevenson and Rossheim, and they found that the head, the neck, and the trunk were the most frequently injured sites. And based on this study, they say that this discrepancy may be explained by the fact that Stevenson and Rossheim included only injuries that were reported to the emergency room. And if you have head trauma, if you have neck trauma, it makes sense that you'd go straight to the emergency room. But if you take a pop in your knee or you get your ankle popped, you might not go to the emergency room right away. So all that was some very interesting data that came out in that study. When it comes to the types of submissions that cause the most amount of injuries, or that tend to cause the highest amount of injuries based on this one particular study, is arm bars, causing the most injuries to the elbow and sometimes the pec. Triangles, and what's interesting about triangles is that this particular study, out of the 881 participants, they found that triangles were the second most common type of submission that resulted in injury. But surprisingly, a lot of those injuries were by the person doing the triangle. So one person slaps on a triangle on their opponent and they either injure their neck because they get stacked, they injure their ribs, they hurt their lower back, and they do the triangle ineffectively, or they don't set it up the right way, and that is what actually caused them to sustain some sort of injury. Now, the third most dangerous submission, or the third most common submission that resulted in injury based on this study, is the calf slicer. And what's crazy about the calf slicer is that I injured myself with the calf slicer, and that sucked. And really, I was doing the calf slicer to someone else, and I blew my own LCL apart, which sucks to say. But like, I had that thing fully locked in, and I tore my LCL. And what's interesting is that based on the video from Less Impressed, More Involved, and some of the other data in this study, the calf slicer causes a ton of injuries to the people that are performing the calf slicer. So that's not to say that the calf slicer is a bad submission or it's like a bad move, but I just think it's ironic that it's a submission designed to injure someone else's knee, yet ironically it's causing a lot of injuries to the people actually doing the calf slicer. Heel hooks obviously cause a lot of injuries. However, based on this study and maybe even perhaps some other studies, I think it would be interesting to see like, okay, how do heel hooks compare to injuries in no gi, because you can't do heel hooks in the gi. And if you took out arm bars and triangles and calf slicers, which, I think there's something interesting there. We're like, okay, if you can only do heel hooks and no gi, how does that compare to just injury rate overall? If you could do heel hooks in the gi, would we see more knee injuries happening via heel hook? But depending on how many people only compete in the gi or how many of those matches that they were studying were gi matches, you're not going to see any heel hooks, but you're much more likely to see things like arm bars and triangles, which happen much more often. And then they also looked at toe holds, inside heel hooks, and all of that stuff. Some other interesting data points were, and conclusions from the study were that white and blue belts were at the highest risk of injury, which makes sense. Brown and black belts had a significantly lower risk of injury. If you were at a higher body weight or had a much higher BMI, you're at a greater risk of injury, as well as if you were at a very low body weight or had a very low BMI. Based on the stats of this study, you were at a much higher risk of injury. If you were over the age of 40, you had a higher risk of injury. That makes sense. You're just an older master's athlete. If you do strength and conditioning work, that can help decrease the risk of injury, but based on this study, it wasn't statistically significant. And that, for me, just based on my own commentary, I think it can be, that's an interesting point to bring up, because we don't always know what injuries would have happened, but didn't happen because someone was strong. It makes me so frustrated sometimes when a pro athlete gets injured and someone jumps online and they make a green screen video saying like, oh, if this guy did this type of exercise or if this guy trained this way, he wouldn't have gotten injured. I think, like, first of all, that is like the lowest form of content creation I've ever seen, and it is so ignorant and ridiculous to even say that. Like, unless you're that guy's coach and you say like, hey, this is the athlete I'm working with, let me tell you, this is the mistake I made. This guy got injured. We didn't prep him properly for this fight. We didn't prep him properly for this sport or whatever. I should have included more specific work to be ready for this variable. Unless you're the guy's coach, shut up. Stop making videos talking about how you could have prevented someone's injury, because none of that stuff, like, you couldn't. Like, it's just ridiculous when that happens. However, all that to say, I'll get off my soapbox. All that to say, even if we do all the strength and conditioning work, it's very difficult to know what would have injured us but didn't, because we were strong enough. I know in my own training, there have been a couple moments where, I got my leg twisted up in something and I was able to hit the heel hook escape or whatever, but part of that scramble and part of my escape, I felt like some pull on my knee, but nothing ripped like Velcro, nothing popped, nothing got overly strained. But afterwards, I was like, oh man, good thing I do plenty of hip mobility work. Good thing I've been training a lot to make sure that I'm escaping these submissions well, because who knows, if I wasn't as prepared for that, both physically and technically, I might have sustained an injury there. But that's just one scenario out of however many hours of training I do every single week and every single year. So it's hard to equate and have an exact number or an exact percentage of, if you lift weights, you will be less likely to get injured in this exact scenario. Or, that guy hit a crazy, takedown on you and you guys, both of your body weights fell on the mat. It's impossible to say, hey, because you've been strength training for the last 6 months, you're not injured. But we know that if you weren't strength training for the last 6 months, you would have been injured right there. It's impossible to make those conclusions. However, just as a general principle, no one ever got injured because they were too strong. And getting stronger is the number one thing you can do off the mat to improve your performance on the mat. And not just improve your performance on the mat, but also decrease your risk of injury on the mat. And when it comes to the framework that I look at when helping grappling athletes decrease their risk of injury, building a strong, durable, resilient body is the number one thing that I focus on. As you get stronger, you're not only able to apply more force into all of your submissions, guard passes, takedowns, and all that stuff, but you're also better equipped to absorb force, and you're also better equipped to resist force. And what do I mean by that? In the takedown example, if someone's taking you down, they hit you with like the nastiest double leg. They pick you up off the ground, and then your body weight is falling onto the floor. You probably don't want to like stick both arms straight out and snap your elbows or anything like that. You know, you want to make sure that you hit like a solid break fall or something to help kind of soften the impact of the takedown. But as you get stronger, you're going to be better equipped to absorb force. So as your body weight is falling down, if you're stronger, you're going to be able to better absorb that force of your body weight crashing to the floor. As you get stronger, you're also going to be better equipped to resist force. So there are certain positions that we get in Jiu Jitsu that we need to stay in to maintain the control we have over our opponent. So if you're if you have back control and you have a seatbelt, the strength of your arms and your grip to maintain that seatbelt control is awesome because that allows you to have better control over your opponent. However, being able to resist the forces being applied to your body, so not just resisting someone pulling down on that choking arm or resisting someone trying to break your grip, but resisting the force being applied to your body that helps keep your body in some of those safe and secure positions is going to be drastically important. And that is one way that you can decrease your overall risk of injury. So for example, if you are, say you're on bottom position and you're playing guard, and you got to make sure that your knees stay not just in quote unquote safe positions, so that way you don't, let someone get past your knees or they can get into mount or get into side control. But you also got to make sure your knees stay in safe positions so that way they don't get bent or like tangled up in like the flurry of a guard pass. So you may need to hold someone in a specific position and make sure that your knee is in a position that's strong and that's secure, that's not going to create too much internal pressure where you risk stressing the inside ligaments of the knee, or it's not gonna, you're holding strong and resisting, and so that way your knee doesn't buckle to tons of outside pressure where you risk stressing the outer tissues of the knee. If you're able to better absorb force, if you're better able to resist forces being applied to you, you're going to be better able to decrease your overall risk of injury. It's also important to remember that strength is not just about force production and force absorption. Well, I mean, I guess it is about all that, but I guess to add something on top of strength, we got to make sure we're strong in all the different positions that we find ourselves in on the mat, and we also have to make sure we're strong through the largest range of motion possible. One of the things that they mentioned in this study was that the arm bar, most injuries happen at the elbow, but sometimes there have been pec tears that happen due to arm bars, and I've seen a lot of pec tears in Jiu Jitsu more recently, which has been very interesting. And when we look at pec tears, there's a lot of different things that can go into why someone tears their pec at Jiu Jitsu. They may have strained it doing another activity, and then it just became the perfect storm where having all of that force jump on the pec, or they fall and try to break their post and break their fall, they end up tearing their pec, or maybe someone has a really strong whizzer or overhook and they kind of drop their body weight onto that shoulder and that tears the pec. There's a lot of reasons why the pec may tear, but the reason why we want to strengthen our tissues through a full range of motion is because we just want to be as best prepared as we can to take on some of those forces at some of those extended end ranges. So when we talk about the pec, if say a jiu-jitsu athlete can bench 400 pounds or 4 plates, 405, that's probably as like way beyond how strong they need to be in the bench press for it to actually matter in jiu-jitsu. I don't think that going from a 405 bench press up to a 455 bench press is going to make that much of a difference in someone's grappling ability, but they do have a ton of pressing strength in the bench press. However, if someone only bench presses, where they only get strong in that type of range of motion, and they never do anything like, full range of motion dips, full range of motion dumbbell bench press, full range of motion push-ups, full range of motion chest flies, or anything like that. They build a ton of strength in this limited range of motion, which does have value, but when they get outside of that range of motion, that's where they start to experience a lot of those weaknesses. And if you are weak in some of those end range positions, like at the very bottom of a dumbbell bench press, where we have full shoulder extension, a full stretch of the pec at that bottom position, if you're weak in those positions, you may not be as prepared to handle some of the stressors that you're going to experience on the mat when your shoulders get put in that kind of position. That's not to say that any of the exercises I just mentioned, like chest flies, full range of motion bench press or dumbbell bench press, full range of motion dips, that's not to say that any of those things will, prevent you from getting a pec tear, but they can just help you be better prepared for when you do experience some of those extreme end ranges on the mat. In the isometrics episode I did a couple weeks ago, I talked about isometric or extreme isometrics, where you are building strength and stability at those end ranges. And this is exactly the reason why we want to do that. And that's to build strength and stability at those muscles end ranges when they're in that fully stretched position. When they're in that fully stretched position, which happens a lot in different positions we find ourselves in on the mat, we got to make sure we're strong. We got to make sure we're durable. We got to make sure that we can create stability when we need to. We also got to make sure that we can produce force in and out of those end range positions when we need to. And all of those things work together to helping someone decrease their overall risk of injury on the mat. Now, the next thing that goes into helping decrease your risk of injury on the mat is going to be your overall recovery. Remember, it's not about what you do in the gym or on the mat that leads to progress. It's about what you do and can recover from that leads to progress. And it's not just about what you do in the gym that decreases your risk of injury on the mat. It's about what you do and can recover from. And I've seen more often than not when guys get injured both in the gym and when they get injured on the mat, and I ask them questions of like, hey, like, how did that injury happen? What was going on? Give me some of the context. More often than not, guys share the things that were leading up to that injury, and oftentimes it's a lot of training, and they were really fatigued going into that training session. They show up to a training session, or say I have a call with an athlete, and he messed something up in his shoulder. He got taken down, landed on his shoulder wrong, jacked something up in his shoulder, didn't break any bones, didn't like completely rip his shoulder apart, but it's been giving him some issues. I asked him about the injury and about what was happening and what's going on, and he says, man, I've been super stressed at work, and I've been training, I try to train 5 days a week and lift 5 days a week, and this was on a Friday. It was my last training session of the week. We were doing wrestling drills. I get taken down, I post, and I feel something, get tweaked in my shoulder. That's how the injury happens. And to me, what I hear from that is, okay, you were training a lot, and on the very last day of your training week, you were training very intensely, and your body is trying to hold on as much as possible and get through that high intensity training in a very, very fatigued state. And as fatigue increases, and as also training intensity increases, that is where your risk of injury increases. So it's important to remember that you got to take recovery seriously. If you want to be able to do jiu-jitsu for the long haul, if you want to be able to lift heavy and roll hard for a long period of time, for years on end, you got to make sure you're training hard, but recovering harder. And what do we do about recovery? There are three main things that impact your recovery. That's going to be sleep, nutrition, and your overall training schedule. When it comes to sleep, it's about making sure that you're getting the right quantity of sleep, so 7 to 8 hours per night, as well as doing what you can to increase your overall quality of sleep. I've talked about it before, but I have a free training course in the Strength Matrix training app called Grappler Accelerator, and that's basically where I walk you through how to kickstart your grappling athleticism over the next 30 days. In that training course, I included something called the Super Sleep Toolkit. And in that toolkit, I break down every single method and tactic I've got in my playbook to help you not just only improve your quantity of sleep, but also improve your overall quality of sleep. Sleep is going to be the biggest driver of your recovery, And it's, by extension, going to be a huge driver for helping decrease your overall risk of injury. Now, the next part of recovery that we need to talk about is your overall nutrition, because nutrition isn't just about fueling your body for your workouts or fueling your body for the training that you do on the mat. It's also about making sure that you're providing your body with the proper nutrients that are required to help recover and replenish from the training that you just did in the gym or on the mat. And a big part of recovery that is important for helping decrease the risk of injury is just making sure you're getting in enough protein. About 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. Protein is going to be kind of the building block for a lot of the tissues in your body. And if you're not consuming enough protein and you're not consuming the right other micronutrients and things like that, it's going to be hard for your body to have the building blocks and the raw materials to help rebuild itself after a hard training session. So sleep, recovery, super, super important. And then the next thing that has an impact on your recovery is going to be your overall training schedule. You can't expect to go balls to the wall, hard in the paint, every single day forever. You're going to crash and burn at some point. And like I said earlier, as fatigue across the week increases and as training intensity also increases, your risk of injury is going to drastically increase. And so if you want to make sure that you're able to have the lowest risk of injury for each high intensity training session that you go into, you got to spread those high intensity training sessions out across the week. Typically, I like to spread out high intensity or high stimulus training sessions by about 48 to 72 hours. And also making sure that you're just giving your body enough time to recover from all the hard work that you're doing. So for example, say you like to lift heavy and roll hard on Mondays. So you're doing 2 training sessions that day. You're lifting heavy, smoking some heavy ass weight. You go to Jiu Jitsu, you do some hard rolls. Great. Tuesday should be a lower stimulus or a lower intensity training day because you just had a really, really high day on Monday. And so if you try to duplicate that and do it again on Tuesday, you might be able to get through it. But then by the time you get to Wednesday, you're going to be pretty banged up. So if you want to have more consistent quality training sessions across the week, Monday, hey, that's your high intensity day. Lift heavy, roll hard, you know the deal. Tuesday, make it either a rest day or just a lower stimulus, lower intensity training day. That will give your body a little bit more time to recover so that way you're fully prepared and ready to hit it hard again on Wednesday. Typically, I like to separate those high stimulus training days by about 48 to 72 hours. And that can give you a good buffer of time to help your body recover between those high intensity training sessions. It's also important to remember that as you're setting up your training schedule, you build your training schedule out both in the gym and on the mat based on your current fitness level and based on your work capacity and based on your general physical preparedness to handle jiu-jitsu training. I might have mentioned this story before, but there's a guy that I know that I've known for years, and he was getting into jiu-jitsu, and he was messaging me, and he's like, hey dog, like I just got into jiu-jitsu. I am so hooked. I wish I did this 10 years earlier. Like I'm so excited. And I was like, bro, that's freaking sick. Like, great job, man. The next day, he texted me and he's like, dude, I went to my next jiu-jitsu class. Like, I'm super sore, but I absolutely love it. Had so much fun, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, dog, that's awesome. He went to, I think he did like 14 or 20 jiu-jitsu classes in a row. Like, he would just go every single day because he was so hooked. And then probably like 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks into it, he tweaked his rib or he did something where he caught some injury and he had to take some time off. And I tried to warn him. I tried to let him know, like, hey man, like pump the brakes a little bit. Just saying, you're brand new to this. You know, you're already telling me that you're feeling a little banged up. Probably like only need to go to jiu-jitsu 2-3 days a week to start until you get used to the rigors, until you get into some better shape to be able to handle those kinds of stressors. And, you know, just pace yourself a little bit. And unfortunately, he got injured. You know, I haven't talked to him in a while, so I don't know if he ever went back to jiu-jitsu. But some signs that an injury was more likely to happen in that scenario was he was going into jiu-jitsu with no prior combat sport experience. So that's red flag number one. And he was training really, really intensely without any breaks and just basically going until the wheels fell off or until his ribs fell off. I think he had a rib injury. So you want to be able to train at an appropriate level based on what you can physically handle. It's okay if you don't go to jiu-jitsu every single day of the week for the rest of your life. Like, I promise you, you will live, you will be fine. And I think that when we get really excited about things, when we get really passionate about things, and we just want to go hard in the paint every single day, that passion is awesome, but we also have to make sure that we have a little bit of a governor, something that's going to help us say like, hey, like, let's live to roll another day, or not even just live to roll another day. Let's live to roll another week or another month or another year. That way we don't just run our bodies into the ground. So, and that tip I think is mostly for people who are new. If someone is a black belt and they've already been doing jiu-jitsu for 10 years, they are so in tune with their grappling ability that they have a much better idea of how to kind of pace themselves on the mat and not just get ragdolled on the very first day back after a little bit of a hiatus. But even with upper belts, it still happens. So if you're new to jiu-jitsu, just remember, like, hey, train as much as you can, but don't go past the point of what you can recover from. When people ask me like, hey, Coach Jay, how many days should I be lifting per week? I say lift as many days as you can, just as long as it doesn't negatively impact your recovery for jiu-jitsu. And if someone were to say, hey, Coach Jay, how many days of jiu-jitsu should I be doing? I would say do as many days of jiu-jitsu you can per week, just as long as it doesn't negatively impact your recovery. When I first started training jiu-jitsu, I was only training I think like twice a week, maybe 3 times a week. And I built that up over time to training like 6 days a week. And, you know, I don't do that anymore. Right now I'm only training jiu-jitsu twice a week, but I'm lifting on the other days. But all that to say, you want to train hard, but you also want to have some, you know, intelligence behind it as well. Now, I think maybe someone could make an argument, and I wouldn't be mad at that if they did have this argument, that what even contributes more to decreasing your risk of injury as a grappler is your overall training environment. And I think there are things that you can do off the mat to drastically decrease your risk of injury, but we do need to have a conversation of the stuff that you do on the mat to help decrease your risk of injury. And the first one is just tapping early and tapping often. I think I mentioned this already in this podcast. And that is just making sure, like, look, dog, if you're in a fully locked up submission and you can't escape, you're done. You're cooked. Just tap and just start the round over and start rolling again. Like, you don't need to wait until your elbow is fully hyperextended before you tap. You don't need to wait until the very last second, about right before you're going to pass out, before you tap to some sort of strangle. For me, my general rule is that if someone puts me in a submission and I can't escape I don't want to say easily escape, but if I can't have a successful escape within like the first 3 seconds, I just tap. I'm done. Like, if someone has me in an arm bar and I can't do any turning escape, I just tap. If someone has me in a heel hook and I can't slip my heel like right as they lock their hand or right before they lock their hands up, I tap. If someone puts me in some sort of strangle and I'm unable to, you know, take off the strangle arm and create a little bit of space, if I can't do that right away, I try to just tap. Sometimes my ego gets the best of me and I still hold out for a little bit, but I always regret it afterwards. And that's mainly because I've just been injured and have caught some injuries in jiu-jitsu that a lot of it was just due to me being a dingus and not tapping early and not tapping often. You know, we're doing a sport designed to take someone's limbs and bend them in the opposite direction. So if that's the sport that we're doing, the more you kind of like roll the dice and say like, oh, my arm's fully extended, it's not extending anymore, but I think I might still be able to escape. The more times you do that, the greater your risk of injury goes up. And I just don't think that's smart. Tap early, tap often, do what you can to always live to roll another day. Now, the next thing that you can, well, let me go back to that first tip. Tapping early and tapping often, I think just goes for anything. I wish so badly, like not the last jiu-jitsu match I had, but the last tournament I did, I think like 6 years ago, I got caught in an armbar, and I wish I tapped a lot earlier. Like, I let that thing go way too long, and now my elbow doesn't hurt too bad. Sometimes it gives me some issues, but for the most part, I've taken care of it. Like, everything is all good, but it definitely pops and clicks and makes like a lot of funky noises, and it feels like there's a little bit of gunk in there that wasn't there before I let an armbar go pretty much way past what I should have. And so all that to say, like, it's easy for me to say as the guy in the podcast chair to say like, hey, tap early, tap often. But I strongly encourage you guys to implement that into practice. If you're training hard, if you're putting in a ton of mat time, like you're training every single day, like you're going to be exposed to a lot of stress on your joints. Your joints are going to be taken to those end range positions a lot. And if every time they're getting taken to that end range position, you're waiting to the very last second, that's a lot of unnecessary wear and tear. That's a lot of unnecessary stress that you're putting on those tissues. And over time, that will increase your overall risk of injury. Now, moving on to the second thing that you can do. Pick good training partners. Pick training partners that you trust. Pick safe training partners. This is a big one. With some of my neck injuries that I've had, I was training with guys that I don't really train with anymore, mainly because they're kind of spazzy and they would do some crazy stuff. And there were a couple times where I was putting my neck in bad positions and they were cranking on it super hard, or they would, do different movements that put my neck at risk. And I was just game to roll with anybody. And early on, I think that was part of like my ego talking, or like me operating out of my ego, thinking like, you know what, that guy rolls super hard. I'm gonna roll with him. Like I'm gonna, step up and we're gonna score up and roll really hard. And I love rolling hard. It's like my favorite thing to do. But I think there's a difference between rolling hard in a safe environment and rolling hard in a chaotic, unsafe environment. And there have been training partners that I used to train with where nowadays it's like the last few times I trained with that guy, he's always trying to do like some flying scissor takedown, and I don't play that way. I'm not trying to have my knee exploded, so I'm not training with that guy. Or if I am going to train with them, I'm just butt scooting the whole time. Like he's not scissor takedowning me. And so you want to make sure you're picking training partners that you trust, training partners that aren't going to do some crazy stupid thing that's going to increase the risk of injury drastically. So flying submissions, jumping guard, even like doing wrestling stand-up rounds when it's super sweaty and things are really, really slippery. If you're in a crowded room, if you have a small mat space and things are really slippery and someone's always standing up trying to like Jordan Bros blast W, like at that point you gotta just read the room and be like, look, there's sweat everywhere. One of us is gonna slip and jack our knee up, or we're gonna, slip and land on another group and risk injuring them. So just make sure you're picking training partners that you trust, training partners that aren't going to be super spazzy. And the other thing that I think that's important to mention too is that you do not have to roll with anybody. Like you can say no. And if anyone has a problem with that, like that's their problem. That is not your responsibility. Their feelings, if they get butthurt that you decline to roll with them, that's on them. That has nothing to do with you. It's not your responsibility. And there are certain people that have asked to roll with me, and I think like, hey, you know what? I've seen that guy roll, and he rolls like a freaking spaz. Sorry, dog. Like I'm gonna sit this one out, or I'm not gonna, not today. However you decide to say it, but you have full autonomy and full authority to speak for yourself and say like, look, man, I'm not rolling with you, or you know what, I'm not training with you today. And that's okay. Now, the other thing that you can do, and I've done this before, where there have been like newer guys that come into jiu-jitsu that have a little bit of like wrestling experience. So they're not a day one white belt, but they have enough wrestling experience to be kind of a spaz, but not enough jiu-jitsu experience to be able to, be that safe of a training partner. So what I'll do sometimes is if I'm working with someone new that is kind of spazzy and like, yeah, this guy can be a little bit of a dangerous training partner, is I'll just try to constrain the training to something that's much more controlled. That way they can get used to rolling jiu-jitsu. That way they can get used to what it's like to roll hard, but in a much more controlled and productive manner. So for example, if there's a guy that has like 1 year of wrestling, but not enough wrestling to like do takedowns effectively and safely all the time. I said like, hey, you know what? We're just gonna start like in half guard, and we're gonna work from there. If you get both knees past my hip line, starting in half guard, we'll reset. My goal or my task is to try to put you on your butt. If either one of those things happens, the game ends. We switch top bottom, and we hit it again. And so I've done that a lot, where I'll try to create a constraint-based game that helps kind of keep the training session a little bit more controlled and a little bit less chaotic. So that way they can get used to the feeling of rolling, they can get used to kind of the intensity of rolling without as much spazziness, so to speak. And then lastly, just make sure that you're, I think John Danaher calls this the 3-second rule, which I think is a great rule. And I pretty much use this for my own training. And if I understand correctly, John Danaher in his training room has the rule of if you have a fully locked up submission and you're controlling that submission for 3 seconds, it's done. Like, that's basically a tap. You let the submission go, start working towards something else. I think that's a fantastic rule. And then the other thing I think is fantastic that John Danaher talks about is the extension versus hyperextension training rule. So you can take a limb, he says, you can take a limb to extension. You can take an arm bar, fully extend the elbow. That's solid. Hold that for 3 seconds. If they don't tap, you're basically tapping for them because you control that position for 3 seconds. However, you don't hyper extend it. If someone's not tapping within that 3 seconds, you don't need to bend their arm 90 degrees backwards over your hip bone. And I think that's just a great rule for everyone. Like, it's important that we are taking care of our training partners. I think wrestling and jiu-jitsu are the ultimate team sports because you can't really get better at jiu-jitsu without having a training partner. You can't get better at wrestling without having a training partner. And if you are damaging, for lack of a better term, all of your training partners, or you're injuring them, or every time you roll with somebody, like someone's rib gets cracked or someone's knee gets popped, like you're the common denominator, and you're going to start alienating people that want to train with you. You're going to start injuring your training partners, and pretty soon you're not going to have that many people who want to train with you, and that can be a problem. So 3-second rule from John Danaher, which I think is fantastic. If you have a fully locked up submission for 3 seconds, that's basically a tap. Game's over, round's over, start over and go again. And then, extension is totally fine. Fully extending the elbow, fully extending the knee, the ankle, whatever you're working on. Hyperextension, not so much. Try to avoid hyperextension. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the mental side of injuries. I mentioned it a little bit at the beginning of this podcast episode, but it's important to remember that this is a combat sport. Injuries are going to happen. Injuries are a part of jiu-jitsu, and I don't know anyone that has, I'm trying to think, like, what would be like the lowest belt level where someone hasn't experienced an injury? Because I know black belts that have been injured. I know brown belts that have been injured. I know purple belts that have been injured. I guess maybe blue belt. Like, someone might be able to go from white belt to blue belt with no injuries, which I think is awesome. I really don't know anyone that has gone from blue belt to purple belt without at least one kind of injury, one sort of bump, one sort of tweak, something that is like, man, I gotta take a week off or 2 weeks off of jiu-jitsu to let this thing heal. And so it's important that we all just understand and are open and honest and recognize injuries are going to happen. And when they do happen, we have to have a plan on what we're going to do afterwards. Unfortunately, I think jiu-jitsu athletes are, there's a lot of dingus jiu-jitsu athletes out there that will get injured and then they'll think there's some like magic fix that's going to help them, like some sort of magic knee brace that's going to, magically fix their knee and put all their shredded ligaments back together. And it just doesn't work that way. These knee braces and shoulder braces and stuff like that, like those things are not going to prevent injury, and they may be helpful in applying a little bit of compression and some warmth to those joints, but rehabbing an injury is a completely different conversation. And if you do get injured, so like in my case, like when I did tear my LCL, when I did herniate those discs in my neck and have nerve damage, in my arms, I had to have a very forthcoming and honest conversation with myself in saying that, look, if I keep training, this is not going to get better on its own. I need to have a very specific, a very intentional rehab approach to take care of these things. And that can be really tough. And so if you are listening to this podcast episode and you're not injured yet, keep in mind and recognize that, look, injuries are going to happen. And when they do happen, you got to have a plan on how you're going to get back on the mat. Just letting it take care of itself is not a plan. Or, I mean, at least it's not a very good plan. And if you are not injured, that's awesome. Both things can be true. You can look on one hand like, hey, it is true that injuries are going to happen. And it's also true that there's a lot of things that you can do to decrease your overall risk of injury. I just laid out a whole bunch of stuff that you can do to help decrease your risk of injury. If you're listening to this and you are injured, you need to come up with a plan on what you're going to do to rehab that injury. And I also encourage you to immediately take action on working towards something else. So someone just, actually, it was a pec tear. Someone messaged me on Instagram, I think 2 weeks ago, and he said, hey, Coach Jay, like I just tore my pec. I was just getting into Jiu Jitsu and I tore my pec in Jiu Jitsu and now I'm super discouraged. I'm mentally struggling. Like, I don't really know what to do. Do you have any advice? And the advice I told him in the message that I sent back was something along the lines of, like, look, man, I'm so sorry to hear about your injury. Like, that freaking sucks. That sounds like it's a really difficult injury. And you have a choice to make. You can either keep crying in your beer about it. Not that this guy was crying in his beer, but growing up, my mom used that term, like, crying in your beer. But you can either, sit in the grief. You can sit in the frustration of being injured. You can do that, and it's totally normal to do that. There's going to be some grieving. There's going to be some frustration. There's going to be some disappointment that happens when an injury occurs. However, at some point, you got to make the decision to step out of that and start taking action towards something else. And I told him about my experience with my knee. I told him that, look, man, on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2022, I tore my LCL. I was super disappointed. I was like a mental wreck for like 24 hours. And then after about the 24-hour mark, so like the day after Christmas, I realized, like, I got to do something. I have to figure out something else to put all this anxious energy into and all this frustration into. So I just decided, like, you know what? I'm not training a lot of jiu-jitsu right now. Can't do much for my lower body. This is probably the perfect time for me to get as jacked as possible in my upper body. And that's what I did. I did a ton of pull-ups, bench press work, rows. I try to get as rocked out as possible in my upper body while I was also working on my knee rehab. And so I told this guy that tore his pec, I said, look, man, like, when you're ready to move on from grieving about the injury and sitting in the frustration of that, when you're ready to step into, like, hey, I'm taking action towards a new goal, go for it. If you tore your pec, you're probably not going to be bench pressing, definitely not going to be doing any jiu-jitsu. But what can you do? Well, you can, if you have a higher body weight, maybe do a little bit of a diet. Try to decrease some of that body weight. Maybe work on your conditioning. Maybe work on building up your lower body strength. Work on building up your lower body mobility. Maybe even do something that's completely outside of jiu-jitsu. Maybe learn a new skill that has nothing to do with jiu-jitsu, like art or music production, or I don't know, do something. It's important that you keep yourself busy as you're rehabbing that injury. And I found that, at least in my experience, anytime that I've been injured and I've been able to mentally shift from grieving and being frustrated about the injury and moving it into something else, I've had a much more productive and, dare I say, even faster recovery than the times that I was solely focused on the injury and just being upset about it the entire time. So thank you guys so much for listening. It has been fantastic hanging out with you guys. This podcast episode is fully homegrown. You guys can't see it, but I'm in my kitchen right now recording this podcast, and I have so much fun hanging out with you guys every single week, helping you guys learn how to pack on slabs of muscle, get brutally strong, and improve your overall conditioning. I got some awesome podcasts that are coming up. I'm currently working on a brand new training course for the Strength Matrix training app. This is going to be all about developing athletic hypertrophy. And we got some awesome podcast episodes that are going to be breaking down how to maximize your muscle growth, how bodybuilding is going to help you as a grappling athlete, and everything else in terms of hypertrophy. So stay tuned for that. If a huge thing that you can do, and a thing that I would massively appreciate, is if you guys got value out of this podcast episode, share it with your favorite training partners, text them a link, put them on game to the Settlage Strength podcast. Lift heavy, roll hard, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.